Good afternoon, everyone. I think we'll get started. Hello. Can we get started? Welcome, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today's session. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Barbara Gibson. I'm one of the senior scientists here in the Bloorview Research Institute. And our speakers today are presenting on a study that comes out of my CEDARS lab, which is investigating how to enhance the human aspects of muscular dystrophy care. I'm really excited to hear the presentation. I won't give any spoilers. I'll start with Dr. Jenny Setchell, who is a BRI postdoctoral fellow under my supervision here. She divides her time between here and another postdoctoral position at the University of Queensland in Australia, where she's from. She's very busy. Her research interests include critical perspectives on healthcare and physiotherapy specifically. And Jenny's PhD in psychology focused on weight stigma in physiotherapy, and it's very much the buzz in physiotherapy, I can tell you. She also has 20 years of diverse clinical physiotherapy experience, and Jenny is a founding member and co-chair of the Executive Committee of the International Critical Physiotherapy Network. She's also a member of the International Society for Critical Health Psychology, and Jenny was the recipient of the Margaret Mittelhäuser Fellowship for Postgrad Study in 2015. She's also been an acrobat and a human rights worker, so she's a very busy person. Bhavnita Mistry, many of you will know, is the research coordinator in my CEDARS lab here, and she's the indispensable manager of all of our projects, as well as an expert qualitative researcher in her own right. Her work critically explores the experience of disabled young people and the effects on their health, well-being, and participation. Bhavnita received her master's in health geography from the University of Ottawa, where her research focused on how health risk information is communicated to the public. Her thesis examined media representations of the E. coli water contamination in Walkerton, Ontario. And last but not least, Blythe DL. Is a physiotherapist here. Again, many of you will know her. Blythe graduated from the Masters of Physiotherapy program at McMaster University, and she's been working at Holland Bloorview in the Child Development program for the past 10 years now, on the neuromotor team, and for the past few years with the neuromuscular team as well. She's also been an important collaborator on this research project, and we are really excited that she could be here with us today. And the team is also here that was involved with the project. So without further ado, I'll hand it over.
Thanks, Barb. So just put your hand up at the back there and wave at me if I'm not speaking loud enough, because I do have a fairly quiet voice. So today we're going to discuss what I believe is a really exciting and somewhat unusual project that we've been working on for almost 2 years now. And I'll go into why it's unusual in a little moment after you've got used to my Australian accent. So the project has 2 phases. We're going to mainly talk about phase 1, which was completed in 2016. Phase 2 is currently underway. And of course I want to thank the funding bodies. The 3 logos up there represent the 3 funding bodies. So apart from myself and Bhavnita and Blythe, who you've already been introduced to, the main investigators and collaborators on the project, I'd like to thank them and mention them. Senior scientist Barbara Gibson, who introduced us just now, Dr. Laura McAdam, who's here, who's a paediatrician on the team and a PI on one of the project's grants, sociologist and physiotherapist Dr. Patricia Thiel, who's sitting in the audience there. Put your hand up. Yep. And Dr. Thomas Abrams, who's not in the audience, a sociologist himself, who also lives with muscular dystrophy of the Becker variety. And Dr. Marla Monk, who is the parent advisor, or is the parent advisor on the project, and others including Kelsey Bell, who's here, from Holland Bloorview, and Dr. Hugh McMillan, who's at CHIO Hospital, and of course all of the young people, families and clinicians who have worked and collaborated with us in various ways. So I might start to introduce the study by just having a closer look at this presentation's title. It's called Enhancing the Human Aspects of Muscular Dystrophy Care. So I think that enhancing MD care makes sense. But then if you think a little bit more about care, it can mean all sorts of things. Self-care, care in the in the broader community or at school. But here we're primarily focusing on healthcare by clinicians. Enhancing the already great work that Holland Bloorview and considering also by extension, other similar healthcare places. So enhancing the already great work that Holland Bloorview does on caring for neuromuscular conditions such as muscular dystrophy. So that's the enhancing the MD care part. And by the way, we're mainly talking about Duchenne muscular dystrophy, which is the most common type and mainly affects boys. So for those of you who aren't familiar with it, MD is a condition that affects muscular strength throughout the body, where young people are often using wheelchairs in their teens or sometimes earlier. And so the muscular strength, including the muscles that operate the heart and lungs, gets progressively weaker over time. As a result, young people's life expectancy is generally shortened to be in their 20s or 30s, although some people have lived to their 40s and even 50s. And because care keeps advancing, it's uncertain when this life expectancy will be. So this shortened life is a good place, I think, to move on to the human part of the title. Of course, MD care is about humans, but we wanted to hone in on, in a shortened life, how do we attend to living it well? I mean, in any life, of course, living it well is important, but in a shortened life, perhaps it's really vital to get on top of this. However, much of the research into muscular dystrophy, and to a certain extent the care of muscular dystrophy, has focused on aspects of the disease such as slowing muscular weakness and extending lifespan. While these are undoubtedly important, however, they can sometimes focus attention onto things such as genes, medication, muscles, nerves, joint range of movement, normal function, what might be called the biomedical aspects of care, that take us away sometimes from remembering the life that is lived with muscular dystrophy and how to enrich it, not just lengthen it. So I think this is worth repeating. While certainly not bad things in themselves, and definitely helpful to focus on it at times, and over-focus on genes or preserving muscle strength or a particular medication, biomedical care, might sometimes mean that we forget about other things. Living a fulfilling life, finding enjoyment in the things we do, connecting with others such as friends and family, and also perhaps on the tougher side of things, focusing on dealing well with a different life to many of those around you, managing possible stigma, marginalisation, bullying, and also dealing with decline and the likelihood of an early death. So paying attention to these things, the joyful and the more difficult, we believe help to craft a better life, which is really, when it comes down to it, is the ultimate goal of healthcare, I think. So these human foci, particularly the ones on the right here, fit really well with Holland Bloorview's strategic plan of leading and modelling social change, to consider disability as part of the many facets of diversity that make each one of us unique. And in a society that sometimes marginalises and stigmatises difference and disability, this is something that is so important to work towards improving. So just to circle back, the gene research and medications, biomedical care that is, are not inherently in opposition to the human aspects of care. They can, of course, be part of living well, but not always. Sometimes over-attending to these biomedical aspects can make us stop to forget and smell the roses. So in partnering, in this study, we partnered with clinicians and families to identify and address local and system-wide barriers to enhancing, where needed, these human aspects of care, whether it be through clinical practice or at a broader system-wide level. Stick there for a moment. So I promised to say what was somewhat unusual about this project, and I guess that's the first of it. It was this really strong focus on the human aspects of care, focusing on developing a fulfilling life. So the second somewhat unusual quality was the way in which we conducted this study. And you can see on this slide I'm about to talk about a number of things that we did, and those arrows indicate that they all fed into each other. Basically, they were iterative and overlapping. We sat with young people with muscular dystrophy and their families during the clinic visits they attend every 4 months. And we noted what happened. That was Bhavnita that noted that. It doesn't look like her though. And we had interactive discussions with clinicians, which involved a lot of what we call critical reflexivity, and we'll return to this concept later. And also had other discussions with young people, and this component is increasing in phase 2, which we're doing now. And also the research team met frequently and argued. Bhavnita will talk about these study elements in more detail in a moment, but we, the research team, which included clinicians and families, thus work closely with other clinicians or ourselves and children and young people with MD and their families to think through these human aspects of care. Oh, I keep skipping ahead of myself. So as we went, this changed the way that the clinic carried out its work in some ways, and the ways that, also some of the ways that clinicians thought about care and practiced it. That is, the project was inherently translational. So we deliberately designed the project to ensure that what we did was immediately relevant to the clinic, hopefully, and to the lives of young people with muscular dystrophy and families, and to be strongly related to what was actually going on in healthcare, not what experts, for example, researchers or clinicians, say what is going on. The collaborative elements of this research align well with another of Holland Bloorview's important key strategies, which is that all priorities for care and research will be shaped and informed by children, youth and families. So we didn't take these research approaches just on a whim, but rather they were based on social science and disability study theories, which I promise not to go into much detail on right now, but just as an overview. Our approach was grounded in postmodern or new materialist thinkers such as Anne-Marie Moll and Deleuze, and authors who draw on these thinkers like Barb Gibson, who introduced this talk today, and whose fascinating book is here on the right. I can highly recommend it, particularly to clinicians and researchers, actually. These authors discuss that by looking at what is done in clinical practice, we get great insights into care. So as Moll says, instead of the observer's eyes, the practitioner's hands become the focus point for theorising. Hence our use of observations and discussions with people that are actually there in the clinic, people with MD, clinicians, families, rather than testing these things in labs or using standardised questionnaires, for example. The book on the left here discusses in depth how to practice healthcare well, how to work to manage the complexities and uncertainties of living with and dying with illness. How to, and I'm paraphrasing here, not directly quoting, how to prioritise patients living a good life and recognise that that may mean different things over time, and how to craft more bearable ways of living. And this often involves considering the human aspects of care. So this is the kind of thinking that underpins what we've done. And now Bhavnita will talk in more detail about what we actually did.
Thanks, Jenny. So in phase 1 of our study, we explored existing clinic practices using these two methods listed here: ethnographic observations of ethnographic observations of appointments in the neuromuscular clinic, and interactive dialogues with the clinicians from the neuromuscular clinic. We're currently in phase 2 of our study, which includes these two methods, but we're also including interviews with clinicians, families, and children. So in the following, I'll talk about the ethnographic observations, followed by the dialogues, but I won't be concentrating on talking about the interviews today, as we're just starting that part. Ethnographic observations are very helpful to capture the mundane and unremarkable features of everyday life that aren't captured through other methods such as interviews and questionnaires. And so behaviors and responses are gathered as it happens in the particular space in real time while healthcare is being practiced. And so over the 6-month period, I conducted ethnographic observations of clinic visits of young people with Duchenne or Becker's muscular dystrophy and their families, which also included 12 clinicians from multiple disciplines. Over the 6 months, I observed the appointments of 14 different families, 3 of whom I was able to observe twice for a total of 17 observations. And we're continuing to observe these 3 families over the course of, from phase 1 for 2 years. Appointments lasted between 2 to just over 4.5 hours. I would stay in the room for the entirety of the client's appointment as clinicians came in and out to see the family, and on average, families saw about 6 clinicians for each appointment. When the clinicians left the room, I would engage families in unstructured conversations about what I observed, asking them what they might have felt about a new treatment option that was offered, change in medication, even a new activity that they may have been offered to try, or even how it felt to take in all of that information during the appointment. From time to time, I would also leave the room with clinicians to observe the discussion between clinicians and their interactions in the appointment room with the families. I would also observe pre-clinic rounds where the entire clinical team would discuss each client they were seeing that week. My handwritten notes of the observations resulted in about 15 to 22 pages of typed notes for each appointment. The notes weren't meant to be a so-called objective account of what happened in the room, but rather something that's an inevitable part of observing, that's not seen as a negative. The accounts are from my perspective, but much of what I wrote was simply who did what, very mundane things. However, there were times I also gave my opinion, such as I might have written that a clinician looked very concerned as they spoke to a family, but someone else might have seen that differently. As soon as the data came in, we, the research team, began to analyze the notes together to identify patterns and areas of further inquiry. The field notes were also used in the dialogues, which I'll talk about next. The dialogues were a series of interactive discussions with the clinicians to collaboratively analyze practices and co-produce recommendations for change by engaging with clinicians to think critically about their practices. In phase 1, we had 3 dialogues, and we're continuing these now. By asking clinicians to think critically, we challenge them to step outside of their roles, think about other perspectives, and to challenge their own assumptions. As Jenny mentioned, this approach was called critical reflexivity, and it's a really difficult thing to do, but this great team rose to the challenge. The dialogues were where we introduced social theory to assist clinicians to critically reflect on their practices and how they did or did not address the human aspects of care and what they might like to change or enhance. And although there were particular goals in mind that we had for each dialogue, we also engaged with clinicians about the topics or areas they wanted to focus on. So as Jenny mentioned, the process was very much co-created by the research team and the clinicians. Each dialogue was designed with a particular goal in mind. The first dialogue occurred a few weeks into data collection. We introduced the clinicians to a social theory framework, Anne-Marie Moll's concept of logic of care and choice. She argues that healthcare practices follow certain logics or ways of thinking. She suggests that logic of choice is a more common way of thinking, learning, writing, or researching about healthcare, though logic of care is often part of clinical practice. In reference to the logic of choice, she talks about how practice is often organized around decision-making and achieving targets. There's an endpoint, and choices are made to achieve these endpoints. In addition, Moll suggests that logic of care is not concerned so much with the targets and endpoint, but more about looking after the whole person in the broader context of their lives. So it's okay with uncertainty and change. This is not to say that logic of choice is in opposition to care, but to look at the practices using these logics and knowing that they can work together. So the facilitators, Jenny and Barb, encourage clinicians to apply Moll's ideas to reflect on their own work and examples from the ethnographic field notes. In the second dialogue, the clinical team engaged in further analysis of the data by reading a full field note of one observation and looking at particularly thought-provoking examples from the field notes. These examples were meant to stimulate creative, critical thinking about healthcare practices in the clinical environment. And these are some examples that we used. What is the ultimate goal of clinic? How do we acknowledge emotionally uncomfortable emotions? And what is successful care when the condition is progressive? Again, clinicians were encouraged to use Moll's logics to discuss the data. During this dialogue, we also engaged with clinicians to begin to think about areas for change, which was the focus of the third and final dialogue for the first phase of the study. In this dialogue, we worked with clinicians to develop a series of recommendations for possible areas of change in the clinic. And we've been working with the clinicians over the last 9 months to monitor how implementation is going. So again, as Jenny mentioned, process is very much co-created by the research team and the clinical team. So I'll hand it back to Jenny and Blythe to take you through what we found and for Blythe to discuss what it was like to participate as a clinician.
Thank you. So the various discussions about the observations in the research team during dialogues with clinicians and with the family advisor provided deep insights into what happened in the clinic and of more interest to us really, some of the underlying assumptions held in clinical practice. So I'm going to give you a brief overview quickly of what we found first, and then Blythe and I will give some specific examples of concrete ways in which the project helped us understand and at times rethink the healthcare of young people with MD. So we'll speak specifically about this clinic, but also we more broadly applied this across similar environments as well. So basically we found that while human aspects of care, which, just to revisit, is the umbrella term we're using to describe thinking about living a fulfilling life, finding enjoyment, connecting with others, and on the tougher side of things, dealing with marginalisation, decline, a shortened life expectancy. So overall, we found that these human aspects of care were important to clinicians. However, the nature of the clinic and the broader healthcare environment perhaps meant that these human foci were often frequently overshadowed by the biomedical objectives that I highlighted the potential risk of over-focusing on earlier. That is, clinicians recognise the importance of human care, but in reviewing the observation notes particularly, identified that often it was given insufficient attention in a number of ways. So to break this down a little bit more, we collaboratively found a reduced attention to human care evident in the systems and structures in place in the clinic, the way that clinician-family patterns of interaction played out, including the words chosen by clinicians to express certain things and the amount of time spent on the human or biomedical aspects of care. And even in the amount of hours allocated for different types of clinicians, biomedically or human-focused. Blythe and then I will discuss a couple of specific examples, and Blythe will also give an insight into what it's like to participate in the study as a clinician.
All right. What it was like to participate. Participating in this study as a team member has been a unique and I would say fortunate experience. It has provided an opportunity for our team to have dialogue, to ask, consider, and discuss big picture questions such as what is the role of our team in the care of people living with DMD? What is our mission? How do we provide care? And what is our approach? To help answer some of these big picture questions, we've been facilitated and challenged to think critically and critically reflect on our interactions and clinic processes with clients and their families. To practice critical reflexivity means to be aware of our own professional, personal assumptions, as well as those of society, and recognize how this may influence our interactions with families and the clinical recommendations we make. I think one of the moments that had the biggest impact on me, and I would say as our team as a whole, was the opportunity to read from start to finish one of the observations of an entire visit for one of the families. It provided a window into what the experience of a clinic visit must be really like for a family. Everyone on our team is aware of how long the appointments are, and we were well aware of that even before the study took place. But being actually able to sit there and read through the entire observation from start to finish really gave us a new appreciation for what it must be like. Many of us remarked on our appreciation for how long these appointments are and what families go through. The number of people knocking on the door, coming in and out, the number of questions we ask families, more and more questions, the amount of information families are juggling, and all the facts and details they are diligently keeping track of. To be able to see the appointment from this point of view really sticks with you and makes you consider the big picture question of what is my role and how can I best provide care? As a team, we discussed and debated this critically. We discussed how we can best address client and family's priorities at this moment in time. As Bhavnita mentioned earlier, we discussed balancing the logic of choice, for example, in my case as a physiotherapist, what objective measures I need to complete, such as, range of motion, time tests, with a logic of care. So looking after the whole person and family, which may include social and mental health issues as well. In trying to shift our team practice a little and we are trying to shift our team practice a little towards the logic of care, we recognize that some clinicians will have a larger role to play at a particular visit, and then others of us will have to step back, and we need to identify when this is the case, or when clinicians might be able to make this shift within the appointment in real time. I would also just like to point out that in reading the full field note and analyzing the interactions with families, this required a lot of trust in our teammates and in each other. Each of us knows that we are always trying to provide the best care for our families and that we respect the role that each of us plays on the team. But even still, it feels very vulnerable when you're reading your own interactions with the families and discussing someone else's interactions and how they handled the situation. So it can be quite vulnerable. Another observation that was brought to the team's attention through this process in reviewing the data was how we handle negative emotions within the clinic visit. The tendency for us as clinicians to focus on the positives, even when the family has just commented on a sad feeling or a loss, almost to be cheerleading. I'm guilty of it, and there's definitely documented proof. So we discussed as a team the importance of validating negative emotions, spending time and sitting and acknowledging the hard and sad moments with family, and how being able to discuss this with the team of how to do that has been really very valuable. For myself personally, this definitely continues to be an area of growth. Another topic that emerged for me was the use of language and critical reflexivity. Reading through and discussing the scripts reinforced the power of language and word choice. Often the language we choose and how we phrase our questions and statements is influenced by our own assumptions, professional or personal, as well as those of society. The dialogues provided the opportunity to review the language we use in partnered decision-making with families around their clinical care. It highlighted how we can genuinely support families and have families feel supported when they are making difficult decisions. One of my own examples from the discussion around decision-making with a family was for me to say, ultimately, the choice is yours. And when I said this, I genuinely thought I was empowering the family in their decision-making process. However, through discussion, we kind of discussed the use of the word ultimately, and that this may not convey partnership, but rather carry a burden of choice or responsibility, or that of making the wrong decision. This led us into conversations about risk and the right to risk and the different types of risk just beyond physical risk. It has been very helpful as a team to have had the opportunity to discuss how we approach risk and how we support the choices of our clients and families in the broader context of their lives. So that's been very valuable. Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
Thanks, Blythe. So Blythe makes a number of really interesting points here, and I'm going to build on two of them using some examples from the observations. So firstly about the length of the clinic, and then thinking about what risk means. So here we are in the clinic. Bhavnita is observing a family. Aman, which is of course a pseudonym. Aman is an 11-year-old boy attending with his mother. He's seen in turn by 7 clinicians. So here's an extract from Bhavnita's observation. Aman begins to ask with a slight whine, how much longer and how many more people? He stared at the wall above the sink as he spoke to Mum. I looked up and I noticed that he'd been staring at the clock, so above the sink was the clock, as the clinician spoke to him. He and Mum spoke about when they could leave, Aman suggesting they leave soon so he could get back to school for 12:30. Mum said they couldn't leave without seeing the doctor. Aman asked why. So in this observation, we saw Aman signalling he wanted to leave about 40 minutes into his 2.5 hour, which is very short because they go between 2.5 and 4 hour clinic visit. He continually watched the clock during the visit, as is evident in this excerpt. This may not seem like a big deal on its own, but while some of the children and youth were very engaged during the appointments, many or most showed signs of fatigue or not wanting to be there. The study parent advisor also reported experiences of disquiet relating to clinic visits. She said that although her son never complained verbally, she could always tell when a visit to the clinic was coming. He was emotionally affected and slept poorly for days before and after. It's also clear that the clinics were exhausting for family, particularly those who travelled, some of them up to 3.5 hours to and from the clinic. So these thoughts, spurred from these and similar observations, caused us as researchers and the family advisor and the clinicians alike to consider how the clinics might be made faster or less frequent and or more enjoyable, which makes things seem faster even when they're not. So this spurred a number of changes to the clinic or thoughts of future possible changes. For example, there's a gradual change being introduced where the clinic attendance is more fluid. So what was a set frequency of 3 visits per year, there's now consideration of times where that might be shifted and not entirely necessary. The clinicians have also increased their communication with each other to reduce the repetition of discussions, of topics discussed with each family. And there's also been an inclusion of entertainment in the clinic, iPads, and discussion about breaks for the child if that might be necessary. And there's an ongoing increased consideration of whether all types of testing were strictly necessary at all times. So this is consistent with our understandings through theories such as Moll's logic of care, of the complexity of healthcare and the desire to ensure that it's adaptable to best suit each individual young person's situation at that time. None of these changes are rigid rules, but this shift changes the focus towards the human aspects of care. We know through other research that healthcare visits can be quite formative in how young people view themselves and their bodies, and not always in good ways, particularly for young people that regularly attend care, as with this group of people. So of course we wish as much as possible for young people to have positive or at least not harmful experiences of their healthcare visits. So Blythe discussed risk, and we can see from the observations that clinicians tended to direct discussions, as Blythe mentioned briefly, they tended to direct discussions towards biomedical types of risk and away from what could be considered more human risks. For example, one of the clinicians, Quinn, and again this is a pseudonym, and 17-year-old Jamie, a pseudonym, and his mother, discussed Quinn's concerns about Jamie being carried by a friend up some steps. Jamie generally walks but uses a manual wheelchair occasionally. So again, this is Bhavnita's observations. So Quinn, the clinician, spoke with concern leading towards the family. She asked about the possibility of using the wheelchair for safety reasons. Neither Mum nor Jamie said anything. Mum looked at Jamie and then at the floor as they spoke. Quinn then asked Jamie about his thoughts about his friends carrying him versus using a wheelchair for safety. Jamie said, "Not really. I don't typically have my wheelchair with me." Mum looked at the floor. She said in a slightly exasperated voice that the friend who was carrying Jamie is a really good friend and is always asking Jamie if he's okay and if his legs got tired. Mum said, "I can see where this conversation is going, but this was just a one-off." She said, "The kids are just playing around." So we know from our discussions with the clinicians in the dialogue that Quinn's risk here is focused, as it seems evident here too, on physical safety. She's worried that he might be physically injured when being carried. This physical, biomedical type of risk was frequently the type of risk that clinicians return to. The risk of breaking bones, of kidney damage, risk of falling, more rapid disease progression, risk of physical deformity if braces were not worn, etc. However, this can be contrasted with the risk that Jamie and his mother are perhaps expressing here. Another type of risk is that her son misses out. Another type of risk is that Jamie misses out on a more playful social connection with his friends. Jamie resists by not engaging and his mother by explaining. Jamie may also have been reticent to use a wheelchair, a powerful marker of disability and a potential focus of stigmatisation. Again, the risk he's acting upon here might be that of social isolation, of being excluded from his friends. So there are these competing risks. And highlighting these was, as Blythe said, quite revealing to the clinicians. It made them more aware of the assumptions they made, in this case, that physical risk was the most important risk to consider. So based on these types of insights, Blythe is going to briefly discuss some of the ways in which the team worked to redirect some of its care towards a greater consideration of some of these human aspects. So she's going to talk more broadly now, broadening out from risk. Yeah.
Thanks. So our impact thus far on clinical practice. So our team has been working on a mission statement, which is almost done. We have essentially identified that our role is to enhance the quality of life in children and youth and their families, children and youth living with DMD and their families. Our role is to collaborate with children and youth, to share knowledge with them and them with us, and share information with each other, and provide care with the aim of supporting and guiding families to meet their individual life goals. We know that clinic appointments are long, and so during pre-clinic rounds, the team flags potential priorities for the visit. But then when the first clinician meets with a family member each day, we're making sure that we ask the family what their priorities are for that visit. From there, we can focus on the identified priorities, and each team member knows our role for that day. We challenge ourselves to keep the so what in the front of our minds, making sure that what we do in our interactions with families are going to have meaningful implications. We've started routinely providing families with written recommendations from each visit, and all clinicians write their recommendations on the same sheet of paper. So this is something that the families can go home with and they can refer back to, but it also provides an opportunity for each of us to see all of the recommendations that have been made. And so often these families are following a list of 10 or more items. We are aware of the need to support mental health. This continues to be a challenge in the clinic setting, given the structure of the appointment with frequent interruptions and also limited time with each discipline. But in smaller ways, we can all acknowledge, validate, and support feelings of sadness, grief, and loss in the moment. And of course, ongoing critical reflexivity. We're always looking for opportunities.
Okay, so I'm just finishing up now, really. Thanks for listening and putting up with us changing over. So really a lot of ideas were generated from looking at the clinic a lot through this human lens. And we've discussed only really a few of them just to give you a little bit of insight. This is the abridged list of recommendations that came out. This is the short list of recommendations that came out of the study, many of which are being underway, being addressed, and of course not all of them at once. So, so just to summarise, there was a discord between clinician beliefs and practices of the human aspects of care, with frequent prioritisation of biomedical goals over these human aspects. The human aspects of care were evident. It's not that they didn't happen, but they were more ad hoc and not so much of the regular part of clinic. The co-produced thoughts and recommendations that you just saw from this study were numerous, and in some ways we've just published that list actually in a similar form in Child Care, Health and Development. The reference is at the end there, so if you want to find out about more study, there's a bit more information in formalised format there. So thank you all for listening, and thanks to the clinicians in the team for coming. It's great to see a few of you here. would like to invite questions on any aspect of the study. I don't mind. Yes.
So, Blythe and Jenny both alluded to factors on team allocation, staff allocation, and training that made it difficult to incorporate some of these human aspects of care. And at the end, you specifically alluded to mental health aspects, but did you guys engage in any training to enhance your capacity to deal with these kinds of issues?
I'll start with answering that. So I have to paraphrase it because we're in a live link-up, and that's why we have to hover near the microphone as well. So the question was, talking about some of the structural and day-to-day limitations on including things like mental health care. I mean, the team has got mental health expertise, and for example, a psychologist is included in the team, but on an ad hoc basis. So if that's correct, right? So when needed, the psychologist is included. So it was more, it's not necessarily that people didn't have expertise already, because that certainly did exist, but it was sort of the way that it was brought into the clinic was in some ways deprioritised. So we're looking at that on that sort of more broad structural level. In terms of training, certainly that's an ongoing, because while there's some people that are trained specifically within their clinical training to deal with that kind of aspect of care, we all need to deal. We're all dealing with people, so of course we all need to deal with the psychological and social aspects of care as well. So that's something, I guess, in some ways we've worked to think about how that might happen as a team, so that's not formal training, so informally thinking about how we might work with that within the dialogues. But also, of course, the clinicians have attended some courses, including one on palliation, so palliative care, and are thinking about other types of courses as well. One that was flagged in a recent dialogue was more cultural training and cultural awareness, and also thinking about the sort of existential aspects of care, so what life meaning can be and how to sort of work with clients around that. So yeah, on a number of different levels, that's considered and is continually being considered. Yeah.
And we also have a social worker on our team who meets with their families on a regular basis and talks about grief. And both the physician and the nurse, we talk about depression and anxiety and treatment and referrals. I think, and then also the whole team has gone through training on solution-focused coaching, and so I think when you're talking about mental health, there are many different facets and different ways of helping address many of the different issues and concerns. And there's a new psychiatrist that's just started with Holland Bloorview that we're referring our patients to as well, so that we can work in conjunction with the psychiatrists. So I think we are most certainly not there, but we are most certainly, we're putting it more to the forefront and trying to shift some of what we're doing to ensure it's an interest.
Yeah, so what Dr. McAdam said there was perfect. It's not that we just identify that one training course will sort everything out. We're sort of looking at it in a much more nuanced and complex way across the care in these various different elements. Like, for example, the social worker role, we identified that a lot of her time had to be spent getting equipment and funding for things, so that could we make, because she's trained in these aspects of care, could we make that less of her time and shift it somewhat? So numerous things like that. Yes?
So first of all, thank you very much for doing this. I think this is fantastic, and really any program in the hospital to be able to have one, client feedback, but two, to even have objective eyes to review kind of what we do, and sometimes we get tunnel vision that really is really enlightening. And Bhavnita we've had some good discussions and stuff like this. I really wanted to touch on the point that Blythe had made about the whole aspect of decision making and the whole thing about ultimately the choice is yours. I think that was the quote that she used. Because you're right, those words do put a certain level of weight on the families. However, at the same time, I think as an ethical paradigm, as clinicians, we are taught ultimately the choice is theirs. And I think the struggle for the families, not only is it the fact that they may feel like they're on an island and make that decision, but also are they given the freedom to make a decision that is not clinically advisable?
Yeah.
Now, we are making recommendations to clinicians, but if we're giving them that choice, we have to also let them know that the opposite choice is still okay, and that if it fits within their worldview and their view of what is important as quality of life, then it's okay. So I guess my question is has that been unwrapped any further within the clinic? Has there been discussions within the team members to figure out how do you approach it, and what are the words that we use and the approaches that we use?
Yeah, so I mean, like that's beautifully put, and just to put you towards a resource, the logic of care and the problem of patient choice, that goes into it in a lot of depth, and it's fantastic reading. And yes, we have unpacked that a lot. We spent a lot of time talking about it. In fact, it's one of the things that comes up a lot, particularly around risk. So I think you've put it beautifully in that it's unethical just to, and this is what the book says, just for patients to decide. It's also unethical just for the clinician to decide, right? And so it needs to be somewhere in between. And I guess what we've discussed a lot in our group discussions is that there's no complete and there's no answer that will resolve that for every case, right? So that is actually a negotiation that happens within each interaction between clinician and client. So it's complex. I think making it more discussed and more explicit, these issues that come up in that, helps. But I think, and we were talking about this just the other day, that sometimes there's this sense of failure if you haven't convinced them to do what you think is best for them. But of course there's that, if you convey that you haven't agreed with what they said, then you risk ruining the therapeutic alliance or whatever, so and disempowering that person. So it's very complex, and this is definitely something we spent a lot of time discussing. Blythe, did you want to speak to that at all?
Yeah, I think the concept of risk and supporting decisions and the language that we use around supporting decisions and not making them feel on an island has come up a lot. And we talked about risk, as it relates to our own recommendations, liability, right? Because sometimes you're concerned about, well, if I don't, then I'm going to be liable for it. But then again, the risk of it damaging a therapeutic relationship, right? And then that can also have more negative consequences down the road too. So I think, yeah, supporting decision making, it's okay to decide differently. The language that we use to talk about decision making and support them in their decisions, like our liabilities, came up, I think, quite a bit.
And it's a complex.
And I honestly do think though, having the opportunity to discuss it as a team is really important. And that, almost to your point too, Daphne, about, does anybody have training in mental health and whatnot? Like, definitely myself, no, but having the opportunity to review it as a team, ask for ideas as a team because it is a process, is very valuable, so that as a team we can say that this is how we're going to deal with risk, this is how we're comfortable with risk, and more aware of the risk beyond just physical, the relationship and otherwise, and also the opportunity to read the field notes. Like I myself as a cheerleader, I didn't even really know it until you read it. You're like, oh, if they just shared something and you're just like, rally, and so just being that awareness, I think too. So that for the whole thing, I think that's what's been really good as a team, being able to, because that's what the family experiences as a team. They don't experience one person. So as a team, how we do it.
Can I just tag on to the original comment? So I'm one of the investigators or one of the collaborators, and part of how we did that, and very purposely, we showed different language being used to say, ultimately, it's your choice, right? So you gave the exact quote, but when we presented it, and I know this because the paper I've written is about the dialogue specifically, just for the clinicians that don't know me very well. We actually gave contrast so that you could think with contrast and think about what different types of ways of speaking that did. So it's not an exact quote, but one of them was,
I understand why you want this, and I'll support you, like, I'll work with you, I'll support you in whatever decision you make. There was something along those lines. So some of it was purposely using contrast in the ways of communicating similar things to help sort of open up how things might be done differently.
I'll take one more question if there is one.
Does anyone on the clinical team have anything they want to add about the experience? No, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you had a burning
Just put you
thing
on
you
the
wanted
spot.
to say, please feel free to say it. No? Okay. I just want to thank Jenny, Bhavnita, and Blythe for the presentation. It was a fantastic discussion. And I have to remind everyone to please fill out your evaluation forms before you leave. Thanks, guys.